She's going to read from her new collection of personal essays called ReadAloud. Welcome.
I really had a chance to catch my breath. I really need to have my breath caught for this. Well, that's a problem. All right, let me. Yes. No, that's not going to work. I'll fall off my heels. I'm going to have to figure out a way to keep my water near me. This is, you know, this is what you're going to bring to the table. I require, I'm clearly a diva. I require a lot of adjustment. Thank you. All right. I'm going to read out loud from a very long essay. I'm not going to read the whole essay. I'm just going to kind of read around in it, bits of it. And I should say that it's hardly an essay at all. I always say essay with quotation marks around it. I think of it as more of a mashup. Part autobiography, part memoir, part performance piece, part science writing, part singing lesson, part musical theater history, and part, as all my work always is, part thinking out loud. In any case, whatever it is, this is from my new book. I have a book. I say that with quotes too because it's trying to find a home. And the essay itself is called Where You Start. And you'll see it was actually written with the design of my doing it out loud. Okay? Need water for this. It's not where you start, it's where you finish. It's not how you go, it's how you land. 100 to 1 shot, they call him a klutz. Can outrun the favorite, all you need is the guts. Those lyrics are from a 1973 Broadway musical called Seesaw, and I offer them here in part because in middle age I have come to feel that given the choice and given the chance, on the whole I would rather sing than speak. But also because, I confess, I want to believe this is true. It's not where you start. It is where you finish. Still, you have to start somewhere. Seesaw, the musical, ran on Broadway for less than a year. I never saw it. In 1973, I was an 18-year-old Brooklyn College sophomore, a girl who wore floor-length Indian print skirts and thrift store furs and scuffed square-toed fry boots and was too sophisticated or too hip, too something anyway, even if I wasn't sure what exactly, for what I dismissed as that sort of thing. The sort of thing, it turns out, like so many things, that I grew out of as a teenager and grew back into in middle age. By most accounts of the time, Seesaw wasn't a very good show, just another mediocre musical adapted from a slightly less mediocre, already dated stage play. It told the story of a Midwesterner, a square, a lawyer who comes to New York and gets involved in a romance with a dancer. Some synopses describe her as a not yet successful dancer, others as a would-be dancer, a kooky, sassy, artistic type, a Jewish girl, naturally, and also naturally a native of New York City. Telephone conversations figure prominently in their relationship. In the original stage play on which the musical was based, Two for the Seesaw, there are just the two characters, a two-hander, this is called, and their two telephones. The musical's book, that's the term that's used to refer to its story, including the spoken dialogue and the stage directions, opened up the action without, it seems, making the proceedings any more interesting. What the musical had going for it was its lyricist, Dorothy Fields. Fields was one of the great Broadway lyricists, and you know her work even if you think you don't, because among the more than 400 songs she wrote are I'm in the Mood for Love, you know, Simply Because You're Near Me, and I Can't Give You Anything But Love, because that's the only thing I've got plenty of, baby. And On the Sunny Side of the Street, and The Way You Look Tonight, and If My Friends Could See Me Now, and Pick Yourself Up, Dust Yourself Off, Start All Over Again. And a song that's usually associated with Billie Holiday, I Must Have That Man. Here's the bridge. He's hot as Hades, a lady's not safe in his arms when she's kissed. But I'm afraid that he's cooled off, and maybe I'm ruled off his list. I'll never be missed. Now, at 18, I knew that song. I knew it and loved everything about it. The way it captured what it felt like to be crazy about someone, even if you should know better, even if you did know better. something with which I was already intimately acquainted by the age of 18 several times over. And the slyness of the rhymes and the way Fields worked those rhymes, surprising us with the seemingly random midline suddenness of them. Hot as Hades, a lady's not safe. That he's cooled off and maybe I'm ruled off his list. Not to mention the sexiness, the scary sexiness of Jimmy McHugh's melody. I knew the song because the year before I'd fallen briefly and foolishly in love with a boy I had no business being in love with who introduced me to Billie Holiday's music. For my 17th birthday, he'd given me 2 of her albums, one from early in her career, recorded live, and Lady in Satin, the famous studio album from 1958, the same year, as it happens, that the stage play Two for the Seesaw opened on Broadway. When I listened to Billie Holiday singing I Must Have That Man, and Rodgers and Hart's Glad to Be Unhappy, and Leo Robbins' Easy Living, and Alec Wilder's I'll Be Around, no matter how you treat me now, of course, I felt as if I'd been indoctrinated into a secret society. Part of this feeling was about the boy who turned me on to the music. Part of the feeling for decades of my life was always about the boy, one boy or another. But a bigger part was the glimpse this music gave me into the art of brokenheartedness. There was Billie's heartbroken voice, yes, but there were also those wonderful, subtle, complex melodies and the lyrics. What 18-year-old girl could resist? Let's see if I can do this one. And every time I pass and see my face in a looking glass, I tip my hat and say, how do you fool, you're throwing your life away. So I was busy in 1973 listening to Billie Holiday and Laura Nyro and Maria Muldaur and Leon Russell and Dr. John and Tower of Power and the Mahavishnu Orchestra, and studying, hopelessly studying, struggling and losing the battle with organic chemistry, and reading D.H. Lawrence and Sylvia Plath, the twin pillars of my personal English major at a time when there was no required coursework, only a required number of courses. This was the golden age of college education. And falling unhappily in love 3 times that year alone, and drinking coffee and eating a daily egg on a roll at the Sugar Bowl, a luncheonette, not a word you hear very much in Columbus, just barely off campus. And the Broadway musical Seesaw opened and closed without, as far as I can recall, my even having been aware of its existence. Of course, plenty of things came and went in 1973 without my being aware of it. Ferdinand Marcos becoming president for life of the Philippines. Ron Blumberg becoming the first designated hitter in Major League Baseball. Ohio, a state I couldn't have picked out on a map or told you a single fact about, becoming the first state to post metric distances on signs on I-71, 4 of them actually, showing the distances in both miles and kilometers between Columbus and Cincinnati and Columbus and Cleveland. Things I was aware of that year: the death of Pigpen from the Grateful Dead, Watergate, the opening of the World Trade Center, Billie Jean King defeating Bobby Riggs, and the New York Times referring to her in the headline as Mrs. King. Mrs. King defeats Riggs. I remember it as if it were yesterday's news. Also, Pink Floyd's release of Dark Side of the Moon, Roe v. Wade, Chris Christopherson marrying Rita Coolidge, and Smoke on the Water. Dum, 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 dum. I have that on my phone too. Broadway musicals weren't on my radar. Not even Sondheim's A Little Night Music, although I'm sure I knew the movie on which it was based, Bergman's Smiles of a Summer Night. Bergman was on my radar in 1973. Thanks to a childhood spent listening to original Broadway cast albums, my parents, it seemed, had them all, and we listened to them on a big brown and yellow phonograph that looked like a suitcase when it was closed. I knew the entire score of West Side Story, of Gypsy, even of the relatively obscure Do I Hear a Waltz? Very odd, but I hear a waltz. Such lovely blue Danube music, how can you be still? But I had no idea who'd written the lyrics to those songs, which were, unfortunately, as I saw it, stuck in my head forever. If you'd mentioned Stephen Sondheim's name to me in 1973, it wouldn't have rung even a distant bell. And yet, in middle age, I have returned to Gypsy and West Side Story, just as I have taken on my grandmother's role in making a Passover Seder every spring. I have discovered Company and Follies and A Little Night Music and Sunday in the Park with George, all of which I ignored when they were first written and produced, which is to say, I've gone my younger self one better, just as I've gone my grandparents one or more better. Each autumn of my daughter's childhood building a sukkah, the little temporary dwelling that the holiday of Sukkot demands, in our backyard, something my grandparents never did, but then they never had a backyard or a house. And for that matter, finishing the Seder every year, which at my grandparents' table we never once managed to do. The trick of the afikomen, the broken piece of matzah that's hidden, then searched for by the children in a competition that's designed to entice those children back to the table to complete the Seder, which can't be done without the missing piece, for which a ransom is paid. That never worked on my unruly cousins. They'd take the ransom money and run off with it. There was a long period of my life when, like everyone I knew, I turned my back on most of what linked me to my childhood. I went out for Chinese food with friends, or played poker, or went to the movies on the first night of Passover. On Yom Kippur, the holiest of holy days, I went to work. It didn't cross my mind to do otherwise, although as a child I spent Yom Kippur all dressed up, walking around the neighborhood with all the other kids in their patent leather shoes, just waiting for my grandfather to return from shul and my grandmother to feed us. Maybe we weren't repenting of our sins and gaining forgiveness, starting out the new year fresh, but we knew something important was going on, and we were solemn and uncomfortable all day, then festive at night when we broke the fast after snacking all afternoon. It was only after I moved to Ohio in my early 30s that I began to set aside Yom Kippur as a day of reflection and fasting, the one day a year when I wouldn't do any kind of work, and started the tradition of making my own Passover Seder, to which I invited friends and students, doing my best to reproduce the elaborate meal my grandmother had made every year until my grandfather's death. By the time I had a child, and that child was old enough to make sense of the Passover story, I had written my own easy-to-follow version of the Haggadah for reading out loud at the Seder table. By the time my daughter, Grace, was old enough to grasp the idea of atonement, she and I began each year to take a walk in the woods, or at least on hiking trails in a park just north of Columbus, the closest we could reasonably get to woods, and talk about the year that had passed, about our regrets and sorrows, pausing at the end to throw pebbles into a stream below a bridge, silently casting out each of our sins, silently asking forgiveness.